Disney World has an abandoned airport on property right near Magic Kingdom. And for a select few years, guests could actually fly and land right by the Magic. But very quickly, this whole venture was abandoned. So, what happened? This is the story of Disney's abandoned airport. Walt Disney himself always imagined an airport coming to his new Florida project or Walt Disney World area. Because remember, he didn't just plan to build Magic Kingdom, he didn't just plan to build a vacation kingdom, he planned to build so much more. A city of the future, Epcot, which would have 20,000 people living in it. He planned to build a huge industrial park that would include all sorts of businesses showcasing the newest of technologies. And honestly, he had really big plans to sort of revamp the way that Americans did transportation. And as a transportation engineer and a civil engineer, this is something that I think is so cool because Walt had some incredible ideas, things that aren't even in effect today. I have to tell you one of them that's totally unrelated to this video, but I think you'll find really cool. He had a plan to have people who are blind wear a small photoelectric sensor device. And that way, if they accidentally walked in front of a streetcar or a trolley, it would detect them and stop. Things like this that no one was thinking of at the time, and honestly, not that many people are thinking of today. But to sum up what he was thinking with transportation in basically one sentence, he wanted to move every single car underground and basically have a car-free city. He wanted to have monorails everywhere. He wanted to have people movers everywhere. And he wanted to have an airport of the future.
Now, the area we propose to develop is between the Reedy Creek Swamp and the Bonnet Creek Swamp. Right now, our plans include an airport of the future down here in Osceola County, an entrance complex where all visitors will enter Disney World, an industrial park area covering about 1,000 acres, and of course, the theme park area way up here.
But when Walt died in 1966, the plans for the airport and for Epcot were not super far along. All they really had was a general location, which is where Celebration is today, south of Walt Disney World. And honestly, all was pretty quiet on the airport front for the several years after Walt's passing, until the Orlando Sentinel reported that the airport at Walt Disney World will be a prototype for general aviation of the future, according to Disney officials. And here's what they had to say. "We haven't planned the airport any more than we have planned Epcot," said Admiral Joe Fowler, Senior Vice President for Engineering and Construction. "We haven't set a timetable for it," he added, "but it is doubtful that we will build it during Phase 1. Other executives said that it was highly unlikely that this airport would ever even accept major air carriers. But here's the issue, because at the time, Orlando didn't have a big airport. The Orlando International Airport that you probably know about didn't open until 1976. Instead, all they had was the Orlando McCoy Jetport, and this had very limited capacity. And the other airport they had, the Herndon Airport, now the Orlando Executive Airport, was also very small and no major airlines flew into it. But with huge numbers expected to turn out for Walt Disney World in 1971, the Orlando area needed to do something. So if Disney wasn't going to build an airport, Florida was coming up with plans of their own. And so on March 22nd of 1969, city officials announced that they were planning a $10 to $20 million jetport that would compete with Tampa, which was nearby, for all of the travel generated by Walt Disney World when it opened in 1971. And this would be built on the McCoy Air Force Base. But unfortunately, it wouldn't be built in time for Walt Disney World to open. Seems like a problem, right? Not really. Honestly, Florida wasn't that worried because they had a whole nother plan. Honestly, both the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Florida Department of Transportation, both of which I will call the DOT during this video periodically, had plans to be on the forefront of an amazing new technology that everyone predicted would be the future. And that was short takeoff and landing planes. These were planes that could use very short runways and were designed to climb and descend at steep angles with minimal noise. And honestly, everyone thought that this was the future. So now it is my favorite time to put on my civil engineering hat and talk about the history of transportation in the United States, specifically as it relates to aviation. Now, the interstate highway system was constructed in the 1950s and the 1960s. And while this did a lot to provide connectivity all across the United States for people in their new automobiles, it also came with some anticipated problems, and that was congestion or traffic. The US DOT feared that as the number of passenger cars on the roadways rose, there would be congestion that would mean it was impossible for people to get places. And honestly, they weren't wrong. If you ever commuted into Boston, which is what I do, it's a little bit brutal. And so what they thought is, okay, there's going to be so much congestion on the road. How can we take people out of that? By bringing them above the road on planes. And so what they thought was the future technology was, instead of driving in between cities or towns, you would take shuttle flights, very quick 10 to 20 minute flights that would bring you to those places instead, and that would be on those STOL flights. In fact, the US Department of Transportation estimated by the 1980s that 1 of every 2 people who was actually flying on a plane would be using a STOL plane, short takeoff and landing. And several states jumped at this idea. The first was New York. In January of 1968, transportation officials in New York claimed that a network of STOLports might be developed within 5 years. People thought that New York would be the true test of this technology. And New York actually did launch some limited STOL service running to Boston and beyond. Florida also jumped on board with this idea. Local news reports were saying that Florida needed to start planning at once in order to assure us of our rightful place in a brave new airborne world. So obviously, we're going to focus on Florida, and in the general Florida aviation space, there were 2 really important things happening in this late 1960s time. The first was that Florida wanted to build a gigantic new airport, and the second is that they wanted to create this STOL service, short takeoff and landing. So let's talk on this huge new airport first, because this is pretty important to the story. If you've ever found yourself reading the 1960s Dade County Master Plan, I know I have, you'll see that here's what they thought would happen in 1975. The first is that the majority of the 1.5 million residents forecasted for Dade County should be driving on computer-regulated expressways that automatically direct heavy traffic to parallel express streets. And the second is that tourists and residents alike should be able to take short domestic flights in and out of the new airport. So that's where we're seeing kind of the combination of this new airport and the short takeoff and landing STOL flights. The new airport would be 39 million square miles, larger than the combined area of the largest 4 airports in the United States at the time. And they imagined it as the supersonic transport airport for the entire southeastern United States. This was back when the USA was developing its own supersonic aircraft to compete with the Concorde. If you don't know what the Concorde is, it was an airplane that, to put it incredibly simply, flew twice as fast as other planes due to the technology it used. Parent Trap fans, you might actually know this.
Hey Mom, did you know the Concorde gets you here in half the time?
So FYI, this new airport did not happen. It was planned to be built where the Everglades are and basically destroy that entire habitat, and environmental laws that were new at the time stopped it, which is a very good thing. But why this airport is so important is because it really sets the stage for the vision that Florida had for aviation. And that was using STOLports to connect to major cities in Florida and around 500 miles of a radius. And the very first STOLport, that was going to be built in Walt Disney World. The Florida Department of Transportation said they hope to have 7 others active in the next few years. It was said that Florida could become a national pace setter for the future of STOLport transportation. So why did they pick Walt Disney World? Well, there's a few reasons. First, a recent survey showed that more than 1.7 million tourists would fly into Florida after October 1st, which was Walt Disney World opening day, and transfer to STOL planes. 1.7 million. That was about 1.1 million from Miami, 250,000 from Fort Lauderdale, and about 10,000 from Tallahassee. In addition, they said an estimated 150,000 Florida residents would take STOL planes to Disney World instead of drive, and then intercity flights, the majority by businessmen, would attract about 100,000 passengers. So there we have it. A STOLport is being built at Walt Disney World. But wait, how is Disney just allowed to build an airport? Private corporations can't just build an airport, right? Kind of. This all has to do with a very important governing agency that kind of controls Disney World, and that is the Reedy Creek Improvement District. This is a special taxing district that came with the same authority and responsibility as a county government. 2 years after Disney acquired the land for the Florida project, they had to make a really big decision, and that was what corporate and governing strategy they would make for this new development. So the week of June 14th of 1965, they had a 4-day seminar called Project Future. And Walt went into this with a few concerns. The first was the lack of permanent residents in Orlando, and knowing this park would need to rely so much more on tourists than Disneyland did. And the second was, quote, the importance of controlling the area so that it does not become the jungle of signs, lights, and fly-by-night operations that have fed on Disneyland's audience. And the idea of control is really what set the stage for Disney to create their own municipality, and this was fully supported by the group from this meeting. And there really was so much that went into the Reedy Creek Improvement District, but a few things that came out of the meeting were that Disney would have the ability to build their own atomic energy facility, to build their own insurance company, to build their own bank, and to build their own airport. And so with their big vision for the future of Florida, the need to transport tourists, and also the Reedy Creek Improvement District, Disney started the creation of the STOLport. Flight testing for an airline called Shawnee Airlines began at the Herndon Airport in April of 1971, and Disney was incredibly impressed with the demonstration and the technology. So on June 28th of 1971, a few months before Walt Disney World would open, Officials announced that the construction on the STOLport would begin immediately. It would be located on the site adjacent to Walt Disney World's main parking area, the TTC. And Disney officials announced an agreement with Shawnee Airlines to provide the service, which would link Disney World to the Orlando McCoy Jetport and to Tampa's new airport. And Disney was also in negotiations with a second airline called Executive Airlines. But then a little snag, because the Orlando McCoy Jetport said that they absolutely would not allow STOL planes to land at their airport. They were concerned with the interaction of the slow Twin Otter planes would have with their fighter jets and the commercial jets. So it was decided that the Herndon Airport nearby would be used, but this was a huge blow to Executive Airlines and to Shawnee, since Herndon didn't have any connecting flights from major airlines. And then another setback. The STOLport would not be ready for when Walt Disney World opened on October 1st. It would take a few weeks for it to open in the end of October. But finally, flights began on October 22nd of 1971. Passengers were bused to and from the airstrip to start. It only had a runway, a taxi ramp, and a 4-plane parking lot. But Disney reiterated their plans to expand the STOLport with a passenger terminal, baggage handling facilities, full instrumentation, and lighting for around-the-clock operations. And there was a lot of hype around the STOL flights. Remember that the Florida DOT said that 1.7 million passengers would take STOL flights to and from Walt Disney World in the first year. But hold on about that, because that number ended up causing some issues. 1.7 million passengers. That would mean 4,600 passengers per day. And these planes were really small. They had a 19 passenger capacity. So they would need 242 flights per day to and from the STOLport to meet this expectation that Florida DOT had. But guess how many they had? Between Shawnee and Executive, they only had 26 flights. Now let's talk about these two airlines for a minute, starting with Shawnee. Shawnee offered flights to many major cities in Florida and the Bahamas and straight to Disney World. And they branded themselves as your magic carpet to Walt Disney World. A day, a week, how long do you have for some family fun? Shawnee Airlines can fly you to the vacation kingdom, where you'll find miles of lakes and lagoons for swimming, fishing, skiing, boating, 2 championship golf courses, and the Magic Kingdom theme park. There's something for every member of the family, even if you only have one day. Numerous daily flights fly in and out of Walt Disney World STOLport can turn one day into a family vacation. Now, the other airline, Executive, actually began launching a very limited service in October with plans to expand in November. But then another snag struck, because in December of that year, they filed for bankruptcy, and Executive cut all of their Florida service. Shawnee did step in and take over a lot of the service, and their president said they probably wouldn't make a profit for about a year. They really needed to rely on partnerships with commercial airlines. But Shawnee was struggling. They were really having a hard time restoring service to some of the Executive old routes. Things seemed to take a turn when in August of 1972, they were finally able to fly into the McCoy Jetport. And they really hope that this might be the thing they need to make their business profitable, with the ability to finally make connections with major airlines. But even with a huge advertising campaign, they were not successful, because basically what they were finding was that the commuter service was really, really challenging to compete with. The commuter service in this way means connecting those local kind of downtown to downtown cities. Because while there weren't other airlines that were actually offering this STOL service, the large commercial airlines realized that these routes were pretty popular, and so they began offering them on their massive jets. And who wants to fly in a small 19-passenger plane with no stewardess or anything when you could fly on a huge commercial jet? And the prices really weren't that different. And so Shawnee ended up discontinuing their service to 5 cities in November of 1972. And by the end of the year, they were out of business. Their president claimed that it was not possible to run the small commuter routes without government subsidies, and they just couldn't compete. So what did Disney think about basically losing their airport? Because while they still had the airstrip, there were no airlines that would actually fly to it. They surprisingly didn't really care. They told officials at the time that it would have no impact on their park attendance. What about Florida DOT, who was also so excited about this STOL service? Honestly, they kind of quickly dropped it too, because the idea of STOL service with the US DOT jumping on board and all of these major cities just didn't really work as planned. And obviously you probably know that, because I doubt that you have been on a STOL plane, and I know that I have not. A couple of other cities that tried to do this. Houston actually offered service to the Johnson National Space Center. It was very quick 15-minute flights to and from. But that airline that offered the service also went out of business. STOL service also failed to be implemented as intended in New York, and people started thinking if it can't work in New York, it really can't work anywhere. And so back at Disney, well, they basically abandoned the airstrip because honestly, they didn't have much of another option. They had to paint huge X's on the pavement to basically show that it was not active. And even when Shawnee, the original airline that flew to the STOLport, was resurrected under new ownership in 1973, those smaller STOL planes were disposed of and this service wasn't reinstated. Now, interestingly enough, in the late 1970s, Disney actually considered resurrecting this STOL service because a company in Canada was testing 50-seater STOL craft instead of the 19 passengers. They thought that maybe this plane could be used for service from Atlanta to Walt Disney World or maybe a couple of other Florida cities to Walt Disney World. But this too never came to fruition. And a lot of people say it's because of the Epcot monorail being built where the STOLport was, but that's actually not the case at all. While the Epcot monorail does actually cut off access, that monorail was not built when they were talking about bringing back this service. The likelihood is that Disney had just kind of shifted priorities at this time. They knew they weren't building the city of Epcot, they weren't building that industrial park. They were really focused on the theme park space. And operating an airport maybe just wasn't one of their priorities. And that's just a guess from me because they never fully announced why they did not proceed with this. So, what does the STOLport look like today? Well, it is abandoned, but when we think of abandoned Disney projects, we think of Imageworks or Discovery Island or River Country, and this necessarily isn't one of those. It's cool because of the history behind it, but if you actually go to see it, which I'll tell you how to do if you want to, there's not that much to see. And did Disney ever use the STOLport again? Not for plane service. Even when Walt Disney's own airplane was flown to Walt Disney World to be placed on the studio backlot tour at MGM Studios, they landed on a different road at Walt Disney World, probably because the STOLport runway was very, very short and the Epcot monorail was in the way. But if you want to see the STOLport, I can tell you how to get there because you're certainly allowed to drive by it. There's just, again, not that much to see. So if you're driving to Magic Kingdom, you're going to see the parking gates ahead. And before you go to pass through those, take a right on a ramp that passes underneath the monorail tracks. From there, you'll get to a right turn only lane. If you look straight ahead, you'll see a road that you can't access. That is the entrance to the old STOLport. So really, all that's left of the STOLport is just a portion of the runway, and it doesn't even have the paint in it. And honestly, that is all I have for you today. Oh, but wait, because if you're a fan of the STOLport, you're probably saying, you missed one of the biggest, most interesting, coolest details about the STOLport. How could you possibly miss that? And I didn't. We'll talk about it quickly. So you might have heard that when the planes landed, these short takeoff and landing planes, there would be grooves like rumble strips that are on a highway that played When You Wish Upon a Star if they flew at a certain speed and descended. Really cool. Feels like something Disney would do, right? It does. But this is completely false. And honestly, I'm pretty sure that I was one of the perpetrators of this rumor and have shared it several times, and I never really took the time to fact check it. I have since learned, and let me just tell you what went into this video. I purchased a subscription to newspapers.com to see all sorts of old archival newspapers from the 1960s and 70s. I contacted airlines and old archives to get copies of initial reports and timetables. I read Walt Disney World shareholder reports. I have been very frequently perusing blogs of airline fan pages. But what I never found mentioned, not even once, not even anywhere in any single newspaper from the year 1965 to 1980, was a single mention of this rumble strip that played When You Wish Upon a Star. So finally, I found a source that mentioned where this all came from, and that was Snopes. Thank you, Snopes, for this information that I'm about to tell you. So here's what I found out from Snopes.com. The rumor actually came from Jim Hill Media, who is a Disney historian and has an own blog, although unfortunately this article has since been removed from his page, potentially because of what it turned into. And he did talk about the STOLport being used to test musical rumble strips, but it wasn't when the STOLport was active. So here's what it says. The Imagineers supposedly used this long strip of tarmac to conduct a very interesting sort of experiment. What sort of experiment, you ask? Well, the guys at WDI, Walt Disney Imagineering, reportedly discovered that if you set up different raised areas of asphalt along a roadway at very specific intervals as you drove a wheeled vehicle in the right direction over this specifically treated section of road, the vibrations would then resonate inside the vehicle and almost sound like music. So as the story goes, Imagineers allegedly used the 2,000-foot-long airstrip at the old Lake Buena Vista STOLport to field test this musical speed bump idea. And this is again from Jim Hill Media. And to this day, I've had Walt Disney World bus drivers swear to me that they actually took part in the field trials of the project. And that were you able to roll down the old runway at least 20 miles per hour, the vibrations that you heard inside your vehicle sound just like the opening bars of Zippity Doo Dah. So no, the STOLport never did this, and I apologize to everyone because I'm pretty sure I shared this rumor in like 2019, but this was never true, although it would have been really cool. And from what I've seen in the Disney parks, Disney never used this musical rumble strip technology anywhere, but it's possible they're still considering it in the future. And that really is all I have for you today. So thank you so much for watching. I love when I can bring my two loves, Disney and civil engineering, into one video and also talk about abandoned Disney, which is another one of my favorite topics. And I'm excited to tell you that coming up soon, I am finally going to cover one of the coolest things that Disney has ever abandoned that has been the talk since the 1990s, the Discovery Island. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you all soon on the next Mouseless Monday.